From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Margaret Sullivan. I'm the media columnist for the Washington Post. The Post is a charter sponsor of the Library of Congress National Book Festival. We want to thank the sponsors, in particular David Rubenstein. You can support the festival with a donation. There's information in your program, and you are urged to do so. Another piece of information is that this presentation will have a question and answer period. There are microphones at the end of these aisles, and you're urged to take part. And there is a book signing at 5 o'clock. I think it's at 5 o'clock. There's a book signing. I think it's at 5. Peter Cozzens recently retired as a Foreign Service officer at the State Department after 30 years. While at State, he wrote 17 books on the Civil War and the American West. His new book is The Earth is Weeping, the epic story of the Indian Wars for the American West. A starred review from Booklist called the book a magnificent single-volume account of the post-Civil War conflicts that shaped our history and the mythology of the frontier. Cozzens' books have all been selections of the Book of the Month Club, the History Book Club, or the Military Book Club. I introduce to you Peter Cozzens.
Thank you so much for all coming out, and as you all know, as I do, the green is to click ahead. I was watching the other night some pundits on a network that shall remain nameless, pundits who shall also remain nameless, discussing the president's decision to add more troops to our conflict in Afghanistan, and they were speaking of it as, of course, already the longest conflict in American history. And that's not quite true. Actually, the longest conflict in our nation's history involving the United States Army were the Indian Wars. They lasted 101 years, beginning in 1790 and running through 1891. Now, before I get into my talk, I thought I should orient us briefly on the period of the Indian Wars that I'll be discussing and which my book covers. My book is devoted to the 25 years of struggle following the Civil War, the climactic Indian Wars of the American West that really shaped the modern West. And the conflicts in my book cover the area ranging from the Missouri River all the way west to Canada, from the Canadian border and the Pacific Northwest down into northern Mexico. That is essentially the area that is covered in the book. Now, although we're at a book festival today, I'd like to begin my remarks with a scene from the movies. Does anyone recognize this movie scene offhand? Okay, by the applause I gather you do. This, of course, is Dustin Hoffman as a very befuddled Army scout watching George Armstrong Custer preening himself before the little Battle of the Little Bighorn. I guess he wanted to look good before he was killed. Now, this scene from Little Big Man came to have an allegorical meaning to me as I was researching the book. Dustin Hoffman actually I came to feel somewhat akin to him as I delved into the subject. And Custer, for me, came to personify the mythos of the Indian Wars, the many myths that surround the Indian Wars. Now, to some degree, of course, myth always distorts history, but I believe that the Indian Wars of the American West are uniquely susceptible to this phenomenon. Much of both popular and academic history, film, and fiction has depicted the period as an absolute struggle between good and evil, reversing the roles of heroes and villains as necessary to accommodate a changing national conscience. In the first 80 years following the tragedy at Wounded Knee in 1891, which ended the Indian Wars, the nation had a tendency to lionize the Indian fighting army and to vilify or to trivialize the Indians who resisted, quote, civilization, unquote. In 1970, the story reversed itself and the pendulum swung in the opposite direction, to the opposite extreme. Americans were developing an acute sense of the countless wrongs that had been done the American Indian. D. Brown's elegantly written and passionately wrought Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and later that same year, the film Little Big Man, shaped a new saga that articulated the nation's feelings of guilt. In the public mind, the government and the army became seen as willful exterminators of the native peoples of the West. In The Earth is Weeping, I have tried to bring historical balance to the story of the Indian Wars. Now, the first step to presenting a balanced history is, I believe, to strip away the myths. There are too many myths for us to discuss them all today. What I'd like to do then is, I hope, whet your appetite for the book by addressing what I consider to be the three most egregious myths and most commonly held myths surrounding the Indian Wars. And here they are. First one, myth one, that the regular army was hell-bent on killing Indians. Myth two, that government Indian policy was exterminationist. And myth three, that the Indians united to resist the whites, to resist white encroachment on their lands. So let's begin with the fallacy, what I argue is the fallacy that the regular army was eager to kill Indians. Does anyone recognize this jaunty fellow? Well, this is George Crook, and he was one of the premier Indian fighting generals in the West. He doesn't look like much of a general. He never wore a uniform out west. He usually dressed in a pith helmet and civilian clothes and rode a mule and was less military looking than the common soldiers. But he was, without a doubt, one of the two or three finest generals fighting in the West. And during the height of the Indian Wars, a newspaper reporter, asked him how he liked his job. And Crook replied, "Not much." He said, "It was a hard thing to be forced to do battle with Indians who, more often than not, were in the right." As Crook continued, he said, "I do not wonder, and you will not either, that when Indians see their wives and children starving and their last source of supplies cut off, they go to war. And then we are sent out there to kill them. It is an outrage. All tribes tell the same story. They are surrounded on all sides. The game is destroyed or driven away. They are left to starve, and there remains but one thing for them to do, to fight while they can. Our treatment of the Indian is an outrage." Now, that a general would offer such a candid and forceful public defense of the Indians may strike some of you, as it did me, as implausible, because it contradicts an enduring myth that the regular army was the implacable foe of the Indian, that they wanted to go out and kill Indians. And Crook was far from being the only high-ranking officer to protest the injustices that were done the Indians. John Pope, who was then the commander of the huge Department of the Missouri, which encompassed nearly half the West, actually suggested at one point that soldiers be sent to help the Indians eliminate white buffalo hunters. The year was 1874. The buffalo hunters had decimated the herds of western Kansas, And early that year, they set up shop in the Texas Panhandle at a place called Adobe Walls and resumed the killing of buffalo on Indian reservation land, buffalo that had been promised the Indians in perpetuity. When 500 warriors attacked the despised buffalo hunters at Adobe Walls in June 1874, the governor of Kansas appealed to General Pope to dispatch troops to save the white men. Pope turned the governor down flat. Indians, like white men, he said, are not reconciled to starve peacefully. The buffalo hunters have justly earned all that has befallen them. If I were to send troops to this unlawful establishment, it would be to break it up and not to protect it. Unfortunately, the buffalo hunters managed to repel the Indians on their own. Now, from these two episodes, what are we to conclude? The essential truth is that the plight of the Indians deeply disturbed most senior officers, and that more often than not, they sympathized with the hostile Indians they were charged with subduing. I could give countless more examples of other generals who felt the same way. Now, what can we say about the government policy that they were charged with enforcing? Its wisdom or morality may be questioned, but it cannot be said that the government ever intended to physically exterminate, I emphasize physically exterminate, the Indians. That the Indian way of life must be eradicated if the Indians were to survive was, however, taken for granted, even among the most ardent advocates of Indian rights. The phrase, kill the Indian, save the man, was quite common then. Well, federal Indian policy after the Civil War evolved in fits and starts. When the Civil War ended, it was in absolute tatters. Neither the President nor Congress were able to fashion a coherent policy, which left things, as General William Tecumseh Sherman, who was the ranking officer in the West, put it, to, quote, caprice and the hazard. Another great problem was rampant corruption that ran through the Indian Bureau. This slide here is famous Thomas Nast cartoon from Harper's Weekly showing a starving Indian and a quite satisfied and heavily laden with cash Indian agent. There was a popular story told of a chief who described his agent to General Sherman thusly. He said, "Our agent, great man, when he comes, he brings everything in a little bag. When he goes, it takes 3 steamboats to carry away his things." Well, things changed in 1869 with the newly elected president, Ulysses S. Grant, who famously declared with respect to the Indians, "Let us have peace." He instituted a carrot and stick policy that became a carrot and stick body of principles that became known as the peace policy. Grant replaced the corrupt agents with churchmen and army officers. He also established independent oversight of the Indian Bureau. And he directed the Indian agents to assemble the Indians in their jurisdictions on permanent reservations that were well removed from the overland travel routes and from white settlements, get them started on the road to, quote, civilization, unquote, and above all, treat them with kindness and patience. Indians who refused to settle on reservations would be turned over to the military, however, and treated as friendly or hostile as circumstances might justify. Now, kindness and patience, not to mention common decency, were often lacking in the implementation of Grant's policy. In the ensuing years, some of the reforms that he instituted, like replacing these patronage agents, were abandoned and the corruption resumed. But the principles that Grant promulgated officially guided Indian policy during the 25 years of the Indian Wars of the American West. The end result, as we all know, however, was to dispossess Indians of their lands. The question then naturally arises, how did the Indians respond to the broken promises, the broken treaties, and to the relentless white encroachment on their lands? And that brings us to the third enduring myth that I want to, if not dispel, at least cause you to think about this afternoon. And that is the notion that the Indians united to resist white encroachment. Does anyone recognize this kind of art, this type of art? Ledger art, exactly. The Indian warriors, beginning in the mid-19th century, developed a type of art called ledger art, where they would take ledger books and draw or paint in them what they considered to be their most heroic deeds as warriors, the deeds that they considered most worthy of remembering and passing on. And invariably, they were 9 times out of 10 pictures of them killing Indians of other tribes. This picture you see here is of a Cheyenne Indian warrior running his lance through a Pawnee Indian warrior. And it graphically, I think, illustrates the point that the Indians not only failed to unite in opposing the westward expansion of civilization, but they also continued to make war on one another. And the reason for that was simply that these were warrior cultures. Intertribal warfare was too deeply ingrained for them to do otherwise. A young man raised in a tribe in the West, he owed his whole place in tribal society to his success as a warrior. In some tribes, a young man could not even court a girl until he had brought home war honors. So, unfortunately, there was no sense of Indianness, that we the Indians were a common people until it was far too late. And during the course of the Indian Wars, an army officer asked a Cheyenne chief why his tribe preyed on their Crow Indian neighbors. Well, he said, we stole the hunting grounds of the Crows because they were the best. We wanted more room. As simple as that. Or, as a Lakota Sioux chief told a government treaty negotiator, he said, you have split my land and I do not like it. These lands once belonged to the Kiowa and to the Crow, but we whipped those nations out of them. And in this, we did what the white men do when they want the lands of the Indians, unquote. Well, those certainly were sentiments that acquisitive whites determined to clear the West of what they considered to be troublesome Indians could readily appreciate. Now, one side point that I want to make that I haven't made enough in the past is that while the Indians fought among themselves relentlessly and throughout this whole epic of their dispossession, the Indians never provoked any of the conflicts with the whites that you'll read about in my book. They never provoked any of them. They were always driven to war, and I think showed remarkable restraint. Kind of a subtext of this third myth, something that's frequently lost in the mythos of the Indian Wars, are the numerous tribes that actually accepted the white presence, that actually welcomed the white presence because it enabled them to form allies to fight their own tribal enemies, sort of along the lines of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Pawnee Indian, for example, were vitally important to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, specifically the Union Pacific Railroad. In the summer of 1867, the Lakota and the Cheyenne had so severely raided the Union Pacific that they essentially brought work on the road to a standstill, to an absolute halt. The Army proved incapable of stopping these fast-moving, fast-riding Indian raiding parties, and so a battalion of Pawnees were recruited as soldiers. Here you see a picture of the Pawnee Battalion preparing for action. Well, the Pawnee Battalion, how many of you have watched Hell on Wheels, the series? I imagine a good number of you. Well, noticeably absent in Hell on Wheels is any mention of the Pawnee. But they mauled one large Cheyenne war party so badly that raids on the Union Pacific stopped, completely stopped, and work resumed unimpeded. And I think it's safe to say that the presence of the Pawnee Battalion along the road shaved at least a year off the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and probably a season or two off of Hell on Wheels. Now, as destructive as the fighting between tribes was, what ultimately doomed the Indians, doomed Indian resistance, was the inability of individual tribes to maintain cohesion against the white threat. Only those tribes that accepted the whites, tribes like the Pawnee, the Crow, the Shoshone, were unified. None of the tribes that are famous to us for fighting the government, like the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Apache, the Arapaho, none of these tribes were ever united for war or peace. Each tribe had its war and peace factions that are traditionalist and accommodation factions, however you want to name them, that struggled for dominance and clashed sometimes violently with one another. You had, again, the traditionalist or war faction and the peace or accommodationist faction in each tribe. The Kiowa of the Southern Plains offer a particularly tragic example of this, of a tribe torn asunder. The individual you see here is named Chief Kickingbird. He was the head of the Kiowa Peace faction. And he single-handedly kept nearly all of the Kiowas out of what was called the Red River War, which was a final struggle for the Southern Plains. And that followed on the Adobe Walls raid that I mentioned earlier. So he kept almost the entire tribe out of that war. Nonetheless, when the war was over, the government decided that they would make an example for a change of Indians who they felt were responsible for instigating the war. And so they ordered Kickingbird to select a quota of Kiowa to be sent east to Florida for imprisonment. Kickingbird argued that we played a very small role. Hardly any Kiowa were in the war. Nonetheless, he was required to choose a contingent for incarceration. So to ease the burden on the tribe, he chose mostly Mexican captives and tribal delinquents. That was well and good, but he also chose a vicious war leader by the name of Mamantai. And Kickingbird's complicity cost him his life. As Kickingbird saw the prisoners off with words of affection and promised that their incarceration would be brief, which in fact it was, Mamantai hexed him. "You think you have done well. You think you are free, a big man with the whites, but you will not live long. I will see to that." unquote. The next day, Kicking Bird died at the age of 39 after drinking a cup of coffee. The army surgeon who treated him said he had been poisoned with strychnine. There had been a fatalistic element in Kicking Bird's struggle to maintain peace. In the unending hatred between whites and Indians, Kicking Bird foresaw the apocalypse. "I fear blood must flow, and my heart is sad," he told a Quaker friend before the Red River War. "The white man is strong, but he cannot kill us all in 1 year. It will take him 2 or 3, maybe 4 years. And then the world will turn to water or burn up. It is our mother and cannot live when the Indians are all dead." I will close my remarks then with Kicking Bird's words, review very quickly the 3 myths that we talked about. Myth 1, the regular army being the implacable foe of the Indians. Myth 2, that government Indian policy was exterminationist in nature. And that myth 3, that the Indians united to resist the whites. I hope that, I know there's a lot we could talk at great length on the subject, but I hope I've left you a little less confused and baffled than our poor friend Dustin Hoffman here, seen looking up at Custer at the Little Bighorn. So with that, I will be more than happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
With the expansion of the American population, the desire for land, and of course gold, trapping, et cetera, could these Indian wars really been avoided?
Some of them could have been, if not avoided, at least ameliorated, because some of the Indian wars, like the Nez Perce War, involved tribes that were already partly acculturated. But on the plains, the Great Plains, where the majority of the conflict took place, I don't think they could have been avoided, because you had tribes like the Cheyenne. The Cheyenne numbered only about 3,500 people, yet during the time of which we speak, they claimed as their traditional hunting lands eastern Colorado, western Kansas, western Nebraska, northern modern-day Oklahoma, and southern Wyoming. Now, it just wasn't reasonable to expect a white, a population of 38 million to turn over the equivalent of maybe 3 modern Western states to 3,500 essentially hunters and gatherers. So a good portion, in fact, at least half of the Plains Indians did try to make the transition peacefully to a different way to an agricultural way of life, but for a number of reasons, the success was partial at best. There were strong traditionalist factions like those led by Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull. They didn't want to fight the whites. They just wanted to pursue the old way of living and chasing the buffalo. But that was, unfortunately, it was just incongruent with such a huge Western population. So some of the conflicts, at least, were inevitable. And it was absolutely inevitable that that way of life was going to have to give way. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you look at Western civilization and you see what happened when something else, a different set of events happened. It was Genghis Khan who unified the Mongols and the nomadic tribes, and essentially, attacked civilization quite successfully. At what point, if the Indians had gotten a leader like that who could unify them, and would it have been able to really wipe out the civilization, or at least seriously impede it for many centuries? What point? Would it be before the Civil War? Would during Tecumseh, who tried, or would it have been later? At what point?
That's funny you mentioned Tecumseh. The book I'm working on right now is a biography of Chief Tecumseh, and I'll be exploring that very question of at what point could the Indians perhaps have united to have, if not stopped white encroachment, at least seriously impeded it.
One leader.
Yeah, one leader. In the West, I think the best chance would have been before the Civil War, would have been maybe in the early 1850s when whites, and I use the term whites to mean non-Native Americans, were crossing the West. We're trying to get to the West Coast for minerals and to the Pacific Northwest for land, and we're not settling in the West. That would have been a time when I think sufficient costs might have been incurred by the government that negotiations might have led to maybe one state, or the equivalent of one state, being set aside for the Indians. But even that would have been a tall order, because disease and intertribal warfare had so reduced the tribes of the West that by the time we're talking about, really there were no more than 200,000 Indians in the West, and again, already at least 3 million whites and more on the way. So I don't think it was ever a realistic possibility, quite honestly, in the West, because the intertribal hatreds were just so great. There was a different story east of Mississippi. I think there was a time when that could have happened, several occasions when it could have happened, but not west of Mississippi, unfortunately.
So if Tecumseh had lived longer, could he have done it?
Stay tuned for my next book. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
Two-part question. One, I wondered if you could expand on your comment that these tribes tended to show a lot more restraint than aggression. And I'm interested in that because they were such a martial, if they had a pan culture, it was that they were martial, particularly on the plains. And so I'm wondering why you think that they showed restraint. And then the second part of my question, understanding that you're an historian and not really telling us how we should feel about what you reported, but I'm interested in your conclusions about what the appropriate response is. Should we still feel guilty as white people here in America, or what's the appropriate way to look on this now in the totality of everybody had a part to play in it?
Well, to your first question, interestingly, the Indians did not consider soldiers or whites to be particularly worthy opponents, and in fact, they had such contempt for soldiers that they would often scalp them and just toss the scalp by the side of the soldier. And scalping, a scalp was an important war honor, not the most important, but it was an important war honor. And they didn't consider the soldiers to be worthy enemies. And a lot of the government had a very wise and insipid practice of, or I should say, nefarious, deleterious, whatever word you want to use, practice of bringing chiefs from the Western tribes to Washington and just showing them what they were facing. And these chiefs would come out east, and they would go back to their tribes and say, my God, I've seen giant wigwams, giant teepees that hold more people than we have in our tribe. And that tended to have an effect of kind of like, maybe we just can't resist this, and we can't resist this onslaught. But I think in large measure it was the former, and that they didn't think the whites were worthy opponents, and the combination of that, plus a lot of them saw the inevitability of defeat if they did resist. As to your second question, the answer I'll give will have to be strictly personal. And every time I go out west to the Cheyenne Reservation or to, say, San Carlos Apache Reservation, and see the poverty on those reservations, and just to see how bad the land is, that the Indians were allotted. It just makes my blood boil. And I think there's a tremendous ignorance on the part of Americans as to the suffering that is endured by many of the tribes out west today. So I think a continued sense of national guilt is appropriate. I think it's very appropriate, and I think what happened with the pipeline should only compound it. I personally think that was outrageous, absolutely outrageous.
Thanks.
Hello, thank you. Question is two parts, but I also want to follow up on what you just said regarding the scalping. Was that something that the white man started initially? And the other two parts of my question were in regards to myth number 3, as far as the Indians getting together. At the Battle of the Little Bighorn, weren't there several different tribes there?
Right.
And the last thing I wanted to ask about was in regards to the status of the Indians in the West. Weren't they aware that the Cherokee Indians had tried to assimilate much earlier during the period of Jackson before, and did they have a communication of knowing how that had already fallen out, that there was no chance that they were ever going to be allowed to assimilate in any case? Okay,
let me try to keep all 3 questions. That's a lot to keep in my head. The first question, scalping, that existed before the first whites came, but the whites picked up on that very quickly, and settlers began scalping Indians. Rewards were offered for Indian scalps, and so it was done by both sides. Your second question about the Indians who were united at the Little Bighorn, you make a very good point, and it's a point I probably should have made in my remarks, is that there were tribes that did form alliances. For the Little Bighorn, it was basically the Lakota, the various 7 tribes of the Lakota, that is to say the Plains Sioux Indians, and the Cheyenne. The Lakota and Cheyenne had a long-standing alliance. It had also included the Arapaho at one time. On the Southern Plains, the Kiowa and the Comanche had an alliance. And the Southern Cheyenne also allied themselves with the Kiowa and Comanche. So there were these localized alliances, but no overarching Indian alliance. And your third question, It
was regarding the assimilation and the fact that, what happened with
the
Cherokees.
Right, the assimilation and the fate of the 5 civilized tribes who were sent out to eastern Oklahoma. They were actually seen as interlopers by the tribes in the West. And the contact between the Plains Indian tribes, like the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Cheyenne, and the 5 civilized tribes that Jackson had forced across the Mississippi was largely hostile.
So they didn't know. I guess what I'm saying is they knew the history of it. Knew that.
I think there was a sense of awareness among some. I've not seen that topic really explored. That's an excellent topic to explore, as to how much peaceful communication there may have been between the 5 civilized tribes in eastern Oklahoma and the Plains Indian tribes. Most of it that I'm aware of was hostile, so I don't know, to what extent those lessons may have been passed on.
Thank you.
It's a good question, though.
Hello. The first question is about feedback from the people you wrote about, the natives. Could you tell us, was it positive or negative about the natives who read your book, And also the second question is, how can we bring healing, because as you said earlier, that it's very sad out there, and how can we bring healing to stop the, suicide? And
I think I just not to interrupt, but I think I should probably just answer the first question, because I'm getting a time thing here, and there are more folks who want to ask questions. Thank you. The first question I've already forgotten, so I'm sorry. This is my fault.
Maybe the second question is more important because it's dealing with current issues.
I prefer the first.
Oh, okay. Okay, because the second question is very hard.
It's a whole other,
It takes a lot of gentleness and everything. But the first question was, obviously, a lot of modern people in the city are reading this book. Of
Okay,
different
right.
cultures.
Reaction I've gotten from American Indians, and I don't use the term Native Americans because all the Indians I've met prefer to be called by their tribal name or be called Indians, and they don't care for the term Native Americans. We do have the museum here in the mall. It's called the National Museum of the American Indian, and that name was selected by Indians because that's what they prefer. In any case, the reception I've got has been very good. Has been very good. In fact, the leading American Indian current events publication used an excerpt, not from my book, but from an article I wrote in the Smithsonian magazine about the Black Hills, the seizure of the Black Hills, as part of their discussion and arguments against what was happening with the pipeline. So the reception's been good, and that, that it's being considered a fair and even-handed approach. As I said, in this book, you will get 50% white viewpoint, 50% Indian viewpoint. I've tried to, again, be completely down the middle in terms of representing, both sides to the issue.
Quick question. What percent of the Indians realized that it was hopeless to stay, at least in the United States, and made their way to Canada?
There were Indians that did go to Canada. Actually, it was the Lakota, Sitting Bull's assemblage of Lakota Indians after the Little Bighorn campaign and subsequent fighting made a break for Canada, and about 3,000 of them did settle in Canada for several years, and they were welcomed by the government of Canada so long as they didn't cause any trouble or raid across the United States-Canadian border. And some of the Nez Perce who escaped also joined the Lakota in Canada. The problem there was that the buffalo were running out in Western Canada, and the Canadian tribes were resentful of the presence of the tribes, Indians from the United States, encroaching on their buffalo herds. And so the British government was agreeable to the Lakota staying. It took a grand total of 12 Royal Canadian Mounted Police to keep order among 3,500 Lakota, which shows how easy it would have been had been a different policy possible. But it was the Canadian tribes put pressure on the Lakota to get the heck out. And eventually the buffalo did run out, and the Lakota were starving, and they eventually had to make their way back into the United States. Sad story.
Hi, I wonder if you could talk about, again, about the 5 tribes, because their territory belonged to them. The Indian Wars took place around them. The territory of Oklahoma was left because it belonged to them. They were a strong alliance. And the state of Sequoia was discussed on the floor of Congress. And so that period, I think, is less talked about by historians because it's not as easy to talk about it as the Indian Wars or what happened east of the Mississippi. So if you could address
I'll
that.
be rectifying some of that in my next book. But during the period we're talking about here, the tribes were settled in eastern Oklahoma. None of them lost any land because of what was happening in the Indian Wars on the plains in the west. They weren't affected by it directly. Tribes like the Cherokee and the Chickasaw lost some land because parts of those tribes fought with the Confederacy during the Civil War, and that's what cost them some land.
Well, I think allotment, and I have a book coming out on it next year, was an excuse to open up land to settlement So I think that
Well,
the end of the Indian Wars made people aware, I think, that that land was there and had not been exploited by whites. So that's something.
well, some of
just
that,
to
the
keep in
land
mind.
west of the five tribes was given over to Southern Cheyenne, Kiowa, and Comanche. But I am told now to wrap it up. So I apologize, gentlemen. Maybe if you go down to book signing, we can chat. Thank you very, very much, and I'll be signing books downstairs.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.